Chapter 1. 7 years later. "So, Harry," whispered Ginny, hooking her arm around Harry's, leaning in close that her words breathed across his neck. "See anyone you fancy?" "Shh," hissed Harry. "Someone might hear you." Ginny rolled her eyes. "So what? What are they going to conclude? That you might actually be attracted to someone?" "Yes." "Oh, how filthy. The great Harry Potter has hormones." "Come on, Gin. You know how it is." Ginny grinned mischievously. "I sure do," she said. "And my question still stands." Harry sighed. It was conversations like these that made him regret spilling his secret to Ginny, despite how supportive she'd been. He looked around the great hall, bustling with the excited chatter of the start of term feast. The Sorting Hat was waiting patiently on its stool at the front of the room, and the first years would be arriving momentarily from the journey across the lake. Students from all houses poured in and took their seats, engaging in fast-paced conversations, catching up with acquaintances that they hadn't seen over the summer. The scene was so familiar, so timeless, so identical to the previous years, except that it wasn't. For the first time in nearly a decade, Hogwarts was having a start-of-term feast without the omnipresent threat of Voldemort lurking in the shadows. And for the first time in Hogwarts' long history, the 7th-year students weren't the oldest taking their places at the house tables. This year, there was a handful of 8th-year students whom, due to the circumstances of the previous year, had missed too much of the term to graduate and desired a second opportunity to do so. First and foremost, among those students were Harry, Ron, and Hermione, but the list also included a miscellany of Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws, as well as a group of Slytherins who had been absent for reasons in the complete opposition to those of Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Most notable in the last group was the enduring enigma known as Draco Malfoy, an enigma towards which Harry's head now swiveled. Harry caught sight of Malfoy's white blonde head at the very back end of the Slytherin table. He sat in a cluster of his usual posse, Goyle and Pansy, Crabbe conspicuously missing, but he didn't seem to be paying any mind to them. As Malfoy stared intently at his hands, letting his friend's conversation carry on around him, Harry wondered what he was thinking. Harry had heard stories here and there about Malfoy's life over the summer, his parents' trial and his disappearance, and then the shocking rumors surrounding his parents' sudden and mysterious death. He wondered if the experience had left Malfoy as dramatically different inside as he was out. For he'd cut his hair, Harry noticed. Gone were the shoulder-length strands, replaced by tufts of a buzz cut. His robes were in a state of casual dishevelment that was only notable in contrast to the pristine, just iron way they usually hung on his lean frame. He was frowning slightly, and Harry found himself mimicking the expression as he stared. "I thought I told you, Gin," Harry replied absently, watching Malfoy fiddle with his fork. "I don't fancy anyone right now. You know I'm still trying to adjust to the fact that I fancy any—" Harry was caught off by a loud bang as Hagrid threw open the doors to the Great Hall, surrounded by a nervous fleet of first years. "Whatever you say, Harry," whispered Ginny, as McGonagall rose to give the start-of-term speech. "We'll talk later." McGonagall's speech was nothing groundbreaking, just the expected platitudes about starting a new era of wizardry and putting old rivalries aside. Harry missed the nonsensical one-liners that had comprised the majority of Dumbledore's speeches, usually pertaining to his desire to begin eating with the greatest haste possible. Harry smiled a little at the memory. The smile quickly became a frown as thoughts of Dumbledore turned into thoughts of Sirius and everyone else who he had lost in the war, starting with his parents and ending with Fred, Remus, and Tonks. The black hole of guilt in Harry's chest that was always poised and ready to consume him at a moment's notice began to open. Harry's breath caught as he attempted in vain to ward it off. Ginny slid her hand into Harry's and gave it a friendly, supportive squeeze that released the pressure building in his chest. He squeezed back gratefully. It was behavior like this that made people, mostly Ron and Hermione, so unwilling to believe that he and Ginny were no longer dating. But it was exactly as they said. They were merely just very close, purely platonic friends. Actually, Harry was beginning to value Ginny's friendship above just about anything. There were times when he'd even begin to wonder if he was not closer to her lately than he was to Ron or Hermione. There was just something so therapeutic and comfortable about a friend that didn't judge you, who was on your side in all things, who was party to your most privy secret. Harry hadn't felt right about breaking up with Ginny on the grounds of anything less than the absolute truth, so he told it to her. Now she was the only one who knew, and it had brought them together in a bond just as tight as, and far more personal than the bond created by fighting a deranged dark wizard for 7 years. Not that he regretted anything about his friendship with Ron and Hermione. His friendship with Ginny was just different. Hermione caught his eye across the table. She glanced down at he and Ginny's intertwined hands, and then back up at Harry, frowning. Harry shrugged. What could he say? If she and Ron couldn't accept the truth about their relationship, there was nothing he could do about it. That is, aside from telling them the whole truth. And he wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. At the podium, McGonagall was arranging the sorting hat on his customary stool. It sang its song, and then the sorting commenced. Harry only half paid attention. It seemed so long ago that he himself had been up there, a quivering 11-year-old with no idea, absolutely no bloody clue, what he was in for. He didn't even feel like the same person as his 11-year-old self anymore, and in many ways he wasn't. Gaps in the Gryffindor table filled with small bodies and young, beaming faces, all of them visibly awed to be sharing a table with the great Harry Potter. Harry Potter, the hero who was experiencing a second wind of fame in the wake of his victory against Voldemort, the likes of which he hadn't seen since his earliest days in the Wizarding World. It had been going on for over 3 months now, and Harry Potter, the boy who had been sick of it almost since the day it began. He'd hoped it would die out soon, once a new crop of young wizards adjusted to the sight of the legendary Harry Potter doing something as mundane as walking the halls of Hogwarts. He was old news to everyone else. His fellow students had never been all that impressed with the flesh and blood version of Harry Potter anyway, some even less than others. Harry's gaze went again towards the scrap of white blonde hair at the Slytherin table, visible through the crowd. Malfoy was grudgingly scooting over to make room for some new Slytherins, who looked just as reluctant to be seated next to the infamous Malfoy orphan. Harry shook his head and scrunched his eyes shut. Stop it, he ordered himself. But that was the problem. He couldn't. Ever since he pulled the boy from the raging fire as he flown for his life from the room of requirement during the last battle, he had Draco Malfoy on the brain again. Not a mental state that was unusual for Harry, certainly, but it was different this time. This time, it wasn't pure hatred that caused Harry's fascination. This time, he wanted to know what it was that inspired him to risk his own life to save that of his bitterest rival. Draco Malfoy frowned as Pansy prattled on about Merlin knows what. Her inane chatter had always grated on his nerves, but now he couldn't even find the will to feign interest. He just didn't care. The reflections of the light as it glinted off his silver fork at different angles were much more fascinating, and his thoughts were distracting as well. Between the two, he had no facilities left to pay attention to his so-called friends. Draco lifted his head as McGonagall started talking somewhere towards the front of the room. The great hall was an incoherent mess of teenagers, and Draco's eyes swam looking for a familiar sight to anchor his vision to. There, the black mop of hair that was Harry Potter. He was situated, as usual, next to a vivid redhead. This time, however, the red hair seemed to belong to the female Weasley, rather than her brother Ron, who, best of Draco could figure, Harry must keep solely for comic relief. The familiar coil of resentment and jealousy tightened in Draco's stomach as he watched Harry and Ginny coy conversation, but now the coil was, as it had been every time he thought of Harry since the previous spring, further confused by another element Draco couldn't quite name. It was something like bitter gratitude with a disconcerting hint of longing. Draco sighed inwardly. His feelings towards the boy who lived had never been simple. Last spring had only further complicated matters. Draco's fist clenched around the fork. Why had Potter had to go be the hero again? And this time for Draco's sake. It wasn't something that Draco could simply ignore or forget. It was impossible to continue hating someone so two-dimensionally after he threw something like, saving your bloody life into the mix. If it weren't for Potter, Draco wouldn't be here now. And he was increasingly resentful of this fact. Although, in a twist of irony, it was because of Potter's very act of heroism that Draco even began wishing that he had died in the fire. If he hadn't been saved, he would have been in no position to have an opinion on the matter. There was no way he would have survived without Potter's assistance, yet having his sorry excuse for a life indebted to Harry Potter was galling, leading him to wish he'd died alongside Crabbe. It was a certain train of thought that brought Draco to his new conclusions and interminably drove him mad. Damn Potter. Why couldn't he just let Draco resent him in peace? Why did he have to go and constantly do things to remind Draco that, personal grudges aside, Harry Potter was a top-notch wizard and even better person? Draco tore his eyes from the object of his obsessive thoughts, hoping that in doing so he could waylay his mind's fixation. It didn't work. Potter was at the root of everything, and therefore impossible to avoid. He sighed. Draco, for Merlin's sake, will you please stop sighing? Barked Pansy. Honestly, brooding is so Death Eater. Well, unless you've forgotten, it just so happens I was a Death Eater, Draco retorted, barely resisting the urge to sneer at her. Pansy merely rolled her eyes. Whatever. Just because some people, Draco gestured towards McGonagall, are preaching about the dawn of a new era, doesn't mean that last year didn't happen, because it did. I know, Draco. Merlin, I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just saying that you need to move on already. The Dark Lord's gone. Your parents are gone. It sucks, okay, I know. I've been there. But you can't fester on it forever. You have to just get over it at some point. Draco bristled at the mention of his parents' death and the insinuation that Draco wasn't able to move on. Pansy didn't know the half of it. If only it were so simple, he murmured. Pansy gave him a look, but didn't ask him to explain himself. For that, he was grateful. McGonagall was right. It was a new era, one in the context of which Draco hadn't decided what to make of himself. Everything Draco had lived for, everything that defined him, was now gone. He wasn't sure what he believed in anymore, what he wanted. The Malfoy name was in tatters. Their proximity to the Dark Lord had made them great once, and now that the Dark Lord was gone, and Draco was all that was left of one of the most pure bloodlines in the Wizarding Britain, the Malfoy name had lost almost every thread of respect that it had once commanded. All that remained was the residual fear, an instinctual aversion to the one-time fearsome associations of the family. As the heir, Draco could encourage these aversions, could establish a new legacy of intimidation and superiority. But ever since the moment his eyes had connected with Potter's in the Room of Requirement, and he'd seen them, that Potter was going to do whatever he possibly could to make sure Malfoy got out of that room alive, despite every inch of animosity between them, and every cruelty Draco had ever inflicted upon him. Draco wasn't so sure that he wanted to be associated with the darkness anymore. In fact, when he let himself waver into idealism, his associations were much warmer, green even, when he got carried away, and not because they were the Slytherin colors. Bloody hell. What was he even talking about? Draco wasn't sure anymore. Draco glanced back at Potter. Merlin. Were he and Ginny holding hands? Draco wasn't sure he'd heard that they'd broken up over the summer, but not that he cared, one way or the other. But really, what was going on? Draco sighed, again, heavily. Pansy shot him a scathing look that only served to make him want to sigh again in response. But he stopped himself. That'd be petty, and too close to the thing a Gryffindor would do. A steady slew of new Slytherins sauntered over to the table as the Sorting Hat progressed, and Draco had to scoot towards Pansy to make room for them. Soon Draco found himself pranced up against the pushy black-haired girl. Pansy was smirking. "Oh, Draco," she purred. "Sitting a little close, are we?" "I'm just making room for the first years," he muttered. Pansy fluttered her eyelashes at Draco, her homely face just a little too close for Draco's liking. No matter how many times he tried to rebuff her attentions, Pansy never seemed to be able to comprehend Draco's disinterest. He'd all been given up trying, finding it easier just to endure her flirtations than just to dissuade them. Annoying as they were, they didn't really do any harm to him. Across the table, Goy sniggered. Draco scowled. Some friend. He ought to have more respect for the Malfoy heir, he thought, before remembering how little that meant anymore. How little anything he used to stake his worth in meant anymore. When everything you measured yourself and your meaning by was destroyed, what did you have to live for? The dead sense of unease that had settled in Draco's stomach as he watched Voldemort's own killing curse rebound on its caster seemed to grow just a little bit heavier. When Draco was honest with himself, he conceded that he really only had two options, and neither of them involved primping the infamous Malfoy name. Either he squared with Potter's complex, as much as the thought galled him, and moved on, or he didn't. It was the allure of the latter option that scared him.